I think it's safe to say that hip-hop is entering its, quote, punk rock phase.
Pulled up in a all black Benz, diamonds on my wrist.
With artists like Lil Lotus and Smart Death both being signed to Epitaph Records in late 2019 and early 2020 respectively, artists like Lil Tracy, Lil Peep, and Lil Aaron all sampling pop punk in their music, artists like Lil Uzi Vert and Travis Scott having mosh pits at their shows, Vic Mensa trying and subsequently failing with his 93 Punks project.
I think Vic Mensa heard Kid Cudi's Speeding Bullet to Heaven, and he heard Logic's Supermarket, and he was like, no way, no way. I am not letting these guys go down in history with the worst hip-hop rock crossovers of the decade. 1 on this one, a light to decent 1.
And we can't leave out acts like Death Grips using the DIY, I don't give a fuck attitude that embodies punk, even if their sound doesn't exactly reflect that of, quote, true punk rock. Obviously, a lot of these acts aren't incorporating traditional punk rock into their sampling. We're definitely at a point of cultural overlap for hip-hop and alternative. Disregarding the idea of punk for a second, rap rock dates back to the 80s. Finally breaking into the mainstream with Run DMC and Aerosmith's collaboration Walk This Way, which peaked at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1986. From there, rap rock could only go up, and it did. After Walk This Way, hardcore band turned hip-hop trio The Beastie Boys released License to Ill. This album contains samples from artists such as Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, The Clash, and AC/DC. Another example would be Boogie Down Productions on their debut album Criminal Minded had a song called Dope Beat, which contains samples of Back in Black from AC/DC. And also in 1986, genre icons Sugar Ray got their start performing what would then go on to become nu metal. Why am I telling you all this? Because during that time, actually, in 1987, one of the many contributions to the world of rap rock and one of the earliest examples of punk and rap crossing over was made from a member of one of punk rock's most iconic bands. The Ramones were in a weird place in 1989. It had been over a decade since their influential debut was released. 9 years since their highest charting album, which was End of the Century, was released. It seemed that their best years were behind them, and after that they sort of seemed to be on the decline. Their follow-up to End of the Century, Pleasant Dreams, would go on to have mixed reviews, and it would fail to spawn a big single. Their 1984 release, Too Tough to Die, would be considered their last great record. By 1984, the punk movement was already in a transitional period, with many bands beginning to experiment and moving on into a more heavy metal influenced sound, and by the late 80s, many of the influential bands had disbanded, such as Black Flag, Minor Threat, The Dead Kennedys, and The Misfits. And the bands that were still around, such as Bad Religion, weren't really making, quote, punk anymore. With tensions rising between the band, the producer of their 1987 album Halfway to Sanity referred to the band as impatient. Then drummer Richie Ramone had left the band mid-tour believing he wasn't paid enough and would be replaced by Clem Burke, who went by Elvis Ramone for 2 shows before Marky Ramone returned. Halfway to Sanity is said to be the final album where Dee Dee Ramone played bass. However, Dee Dee was credited as the bassist on their follow-up, Brain Drain, though several session musicians, including producer Daniel Ray, played for him instead. In his memoir, Dee Dee Ramone wrote, "It was tough going through the Brain Drain album because everyone took their shit out on me. I dreaded being around them. It drove me away. I didn't even end up playing on the album. Everybody in the band had problems. Girlfriend problems, money problems, mental problems." However, despite not being the bassist for the band anymore, several of his songs ended up on Brain Drain. One of the most notable songs from this album would be Pet Sematary, going on to become one of the band's biggest hits. They were on MTV more than they had ever been. And the song itself was featured during the end credits of the 1990 film based off of the Stephen King book of the same name, despite being nominated for a Razzie Award for Worst Original Song. The song's origin story itself is also somewhat murky. While it is true that the Ramones met and had dinner at some point with Stephen King, the stories are conflicting as to where it happened and what happened, with Marky Ramone claiming that the group had dinner at King's home, where Dee Dee was given a copy of Pet Sematary, to which King rebutted saying, "They never even came to my house. We ate at Miller's Restaurant, the only fancy restaurant in Bangor. I don't even remember if we talked about Pet Sematary. I might have said something about a song. what I remember is that Marky was the only one who was articulate. The other ones really weren't. In his memoir, Marky Ramone recalled that after Dee Dee was given the book, he left to the basement of King's home and returned an hour later with the lyrics to Pet Sematary. This is when Marky said that this showed that Dee Dee could possibly be successful in his attempt at a solo career. Either way, the night they met with Stephen King was the night Dee Dee Ramone left the group. In 1987, during a stint in rehab, Dee Dee Ramone discovered rap music. According to Ramones producer Daniel Ray, many of the African-American patients that were with Dee Dee in rehab referred to him as Dougie Fresh, as Doug was his real name, and that once he left, he was a rapper. He was into rap. That same year, Dee Dee released his debut single, Funky Man, and it was interesting.
Funky.
According to his bandmates, he traded in his leather jacket for a Kangol hat, thick gold chains, and tracksuits, much like Run DMC, to which the group, especially Johnny, were not amused by.
He became a rapper for a while, one of the first white rappers, and started dressing in his rap clothes before he'd go put on his Ramones clothes. It was bizarre. And started talking like a rapper and everything else, and talking like a black person. He's like...
As for his transition into hip-hop music and style, Daniel Ray went on to state that, "I wasn't involved with Funky Man. I didn't like it so much. I thought it was kind of sloppy, it was kind of rough. And I thought it would be pretty short-lived, but Dee Dee was determined to put some songs together. And Dee Dee wasn't a great singer, so rapping seemed to work for him. He always needed to be busy, so if the Ramones were done with a record, he still needed to be creative. He was in a weird headspace at that point. He felt like he was being controlled by his wife, by Johnny, and he was on all of these medications his psychiatrist was giving him. His whole life was laid out for him, what he was supposed to do and where he was supposed to go. He needed to challenge himself. Conformity drove him crazy. The Ramones became conformity for him. He just wanted to rebel against that. And one way to do that was to do a rap record. And it would get him out of the house. It would make Johnny really pissed off. When he started doing it, Johnny basically rolled his eyes. The unanimous opinion was, "Oh, that Dee Dee." After Funky Man was released, armed with $25,000 from their record label, King, Ray, and audio engineer Greg Gordon began recording at the legendary Chung King Studios, which at the time was referred to as the Abbey Road of hip-hop, due to their sessions with the Beastie Boys, Run DMC, LL Cool J, and later on with the Notorious B.I.G. and Nas. However, this album would not be recorded in the, quote, traditional hip-hop fashion, such as using samples, with Greg Gordon going on to say, "Other guys would come in and dig through old records and find grooves and try to play stuff off each other, but this was made more like an old-time rock record with a drum machine." This wasn't the initial idea, though. According to Marky Ramone, Dee Dee asked him to play drums on the album, but Marky declined, saying that "I was a rocker, not a rapper." The album came together rather quickly, and in March of 1989, Dee Dee King's debut effort, Standing in the Spotlight, was released.
It's time to rock.
I really don't like labeling music as the worst because, it's all subjective.
It's time to rap.
I mean this when I say this is one of the worst goddamn albums I've heard in a while.
It's time for the mashed potato attack.
Now, even though it was obvious from the beginning that Funky Man was not a good song, at least it sounded like he was kind of trying to make hip-hop music. Keep in mind, that was in 1987, so gangsta rap had not really come into its full persona yet. I mean, yes, groups like NWA and Public Enemy were active, but had not released their landmark albums such as Straight Outta Compton and It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. Those wouldn't come out until mid-1988. And Biz Markie would hit it big with his 1989 single, Just a Friend, a couple months after this album. So honestly, this was probably the best time to release a fun golden age hip-hop album. But the opening, Mashed Potato Time, was such an odd way to start the album. It's a re-recording of the 1962 doo-wop hit of the same name by Dee Dee Sharp.
Come on, honey.
based off the dance craze of the same name. It's such an odd choice, and I'm not entirely sure what his motive was here. Was he trying to bring back a dance craze from 3 decades prior? Questionable motives aside, you may recognize the style of Sharp's song was used in another hit from 1962.
I was working in the lab late one night when my eyes beheld an eerie sight.
But that's not the only similarity that Dee Dee King's Mashed Potato Time would have to Monster Mash. Listening to the album now, like many listeners of this album, I thought King was simply like paying tribute to Bobby Boris Pickett's Boris Karloff impression that he used in the Monster Mash. Especially because at that point the listener is only familiar with his flow on Funky Man. Sadly, his flow doesn't change at all during the album.
Well, I drive a Mercedes. I like to impress the ladies and knock out the homeboys too. This ain't the twist or the boogaloo.
That's how he raps. His flow never changes, his rhyme scheme never changes, and on songs like Commotion in the Ocean, his syllables don't even fit his flow. However, after 2 tracks of rapping, King abandons his new hip-hop identity for a traditional rock and roll ballad sound on Baby Doll. While the track is a little cheesy, it is more tolerable than the vast majority of tone-deaf hip-hop songs on the album. This song is followed up with Poor Little Rich Girl, the most Ramones-esque song on the record, down to the chorus being sung by a Joey Ramone sound-alike.
She's a poor little rich girl. She's a poor little rich girl. She's a poor little rich girl.
Now, Dee Dee King would continue to write songs for the Ramones after his departure as late as the Ramones' final album. I wouldn't be surprised if this would later be re-recorded for a later Ramones record, because I actually think the song is kind of good. Maybe it's because Dee Dee is in his element on Poor Little Rich Girl. The song actually kind of gave me hope that this album may not be as bad as I've read.
I am a surf nut and the surf is up. I'm headed for Sunset Beach. It's not far, not hard to reach where coconuts grow on palm trees. I can smell the breeze.
This is the worst song on the album, bar none. To clarify, Dee Dee was never a great lyricist, but the Ramones played with such attitude and the subject matter was so edgy for the time. But what is this song?
There by the water, that's where I saw her. A beautiful mermaid, and she was afraid. She had never seen a human before, and she started pointing at the shorts I wore. The ones with the Hawaiian print, so bright she had to squint. What language are you speaking? You know I am seeking.
I'm not being too hard on this song because it's goofy. Goofy subject matter wasn't a foreign concept in the 1980s. Run DMC, one of the most influential rap groups of all time, have a whole song about being goofy and doing things like ordering a Big Mac and fries at KFC. The only difference is that Run DMC had a sense of flow and can rap above a 3rd grade level. It's almost hard to believe that King, someone who wrote songs referring to blitzkriegs, heroin addictions, spots in New York where King may or may not have solicited himself for drug money, and lobotomies, could write such simplistic and senseless lyrics considering he was held in such high regard in the punk world as one of the innovators of the genre.
There is a true tale, why the ones that deal, all the ones that fail, yeah. You can move if you want to move.
1989 saw Axed release autoethnographic songs about things pertaining to the crack epidemic, police brutality, feminism, and other socially and politically conscious subject matter. King claimed to identify with this ideology.
When Schoolie D came out with that album, and he would say, "What time is it?" And it's Gucci time, you know. I understood that. It's rising above oppression, you know. A Negro being able to buy a Gucci watch. Great, you know. I'm a Negro too. I felt the same excitement when I could buy a Gucci watch and spend a lot of money. Like an outlaw.
So, how does Dee Dee King level the playing field in relation to the African American struggle in America during the 80s? Now, Real quick, if you go and listen to the album, you may recognize that all female vocals are performed by Debbie Harry of Blondie, whose drummer is technically a Ramone. As I mentioned previously, Clem Burke, aka Elvis Ramone, filled in for 2 shows in between the departure of CJ and the return of Marky. Not surprisingly, this short chorus is the highlight of the song and is pretty catchy. The rest of the song, though...
Ich finde es gut, wann Leute lachen. Ich hab der Energie, ich hab der Kraft. Ein hübsches Mädchen gibt mir einen Kuss. Ein Geld für den Taxi, nehm den Bus. Ich bin der König von mein Haus. Und wenn die Kinder sind zu laut, schrei ich, geh raus.
Needless to say, his German rapping is about as erratic as his English rapping, and follows the same basic rhyming pattern and Boris flow. It would have been interesting if he actually wrote about his struggle growing up in New York, or all the wild shit he would get into on tour, or his struggle with drugs, but the most we get is this.
Well, I used to be a German kid standing on the street with 2 cents in my pocket and nothing to eat.
By this point, it's apparent that Dee Dee King is a fan of and wants to understand hip-hop and its cultural struggles. However, he completely fumbles the opportunity to actually relate to his New York contemporaries in other ways by talking about his culture as opposed to anything else. And even then, his bars are barely surface level. There is an interview with Dee Dee King on the Joe Franklin Show in the late 80s that has been lost to time. However, while doing my research for this episode, I read that those who have seen the interview have referred to it as bizarre, as we have someone who does not yet understand hip-hop as a genre, and someone who is basically not qualified to explain it having a conversation about it. When asked by Franklin if his then upcoming rap project will have a similar social awareness to the work of the Ramones, King responds by saying that his rap music is made under a persona, and Dee Dee King is not Dee Dee Ramone, but a character, furthermore proving the notion that he has no idea what he's doing. The only other song on the record worth mentioning is The Crusher. A song about professional wrestling, and the only other song that wouldn't sound completely out of place on a Ramones record. So much so that the Ramones went on to cover it on their final studio album, Adios Amigos, with CJ Ramone taking over vocals in place of Dee Dee and Joey Ramone singing the chorus. I'm kind of sad they opted to cover this instead of Poor Little Rich Girl, as the chorus for Poor Little Rich Girl was made for Joey Ramone, and you can't convince me otherwise. Nonetheless, the fact that a song on this album would later be on a Ramones album says a lot about the terms that Dee Dee and the rest of the group were on. And that's about it for the album. If you actually want to go and listen to it, believe it or not, it's on Spotify, with Mashed Potato Time having the highest number of streams and every other song on the album slowly declining. The album also had a release on CD, vinyl, and cassette, all in 1989, with one vinyl version going for around $80 to $100 on Discogs, and the other hovering around the $30 to $150 mark. However, you can buy a new copy for around $15, as it was repressed in 2017. Who asked for this? I'm not sure, but if you really want a physical copy, it's pretty affordable. Sales data on the album is pretty hard to come across. It failed to chart on Billboard. In hindsight, the album has been referred to as one of the worst examples of rapping from a confident musician. Matt Carlson of AllMusic said it will go down in the annals of pop culture as one of the worst recordings of all time. Producer Daniel Ray said the reviews were wonderfully brutal, with Maximum Rock and Roll releasing their top 10 worst albums of the year, and saying, "We could have included the Dee Dee King album, but we only listened to albums that were recorded in English." He said that was his favorite one. In the Ramones documentary, End of the Century, Dee Dee Ramone reflected on his lack of skill when it came to hip-hop, stating,
I don't think it was worth fighting over. It wasn't so good anyway, the album. You know, I couldn't do rap. I was trying. I don't know how. I'm not good enough to know. I'm not a Negro or something. I don't know what it is. I just can't do it. I wanted to.
I mean, I can get what he's saying, but word choice, man. But how did the Ramones react to Dee Dee's solo hip-hop endeavor?
One of the Ramones is doing something individually now. He was here.
Yeah, Dee Dee.
Dee.
Yeah, Brother Dee Dee.
Dee Dee King.
Now, when he steps out and does a thing like that, is that with your blessing and approval?
Yes, we bless him all the way.
All the way, right?
Give him our blessings.
Mm-hmm.
I think as annoyed as they were with Dee Dee's rebelling, they were supportive regardless, as Dee Dee was still involved through the writing of their final album, and even sang guest vocals on some of the songs. Johnny hoped the album would be a success, even if the reason was so that he could kickstart his own solo career, which obviously never happened. But it was his idea to put the pressure on Adios Amigos, which, according to Daniel Ray, meant a lot to Dee Dee. It meant that Johnny actually took time to listen to the album. After this album, Dee Dee King was no more, and Dee Dee Ramone began releasing punk music in bands like Dee Dee Ramone and the Spiky Tops, Dee Dee Ramone and the Chinese Dragons, Dee Dee Ramone ICLC, who released the album I Hate Freaks Like You. Using his Dee Dee Ramone stage name, it released Zonked, which contained contributions from Marky and Joey Ramone, Hop Around, and most interestingly, Greatest and Latest, which is mostly re-recordings of Ramone's songs with Dee Dee vocals. He even played in a Ramones tribute band by the name of the Remains with Marky, CJ, and his wife Barbara Ramone. But standing in the spotlight will always be remembered as his first and sadly his worst solo effort. In his memoir Lobotomy, Surviving the Ramones, Dee Dee says that there are no happy endings in the story of the Ramones, just points where it was fun. While the Dee Dee King experiment was a complete disaster and definitely didn't have a happy ending, I think it was obvious that Dee Dee had fun taking a break from what he felt like was becoming a day job and deciding to make the music that he wanted to make.